half of our church family. It is good to see you today. I hope that you weren't too inconvenienced by the two moving trucks in the parking lots this morning. And then I hope you won't be too inconvenienced to come help unload those two moving trucks tomorrow. It's good to be back. I appreciate Brother John Clark, it's great when you have an elder who get on a plane and fly halfway around the country and help you drive trucks back. That was just a true blessing. I also want to give praise to our audio video fellas here, Steve and the others who've been working in the sound booth. You may or may not have noticed this on Facebook, but we now have a YouTube channel for the Waterford Church of Christ. So if you go to YouTube and just type in Waterford Church of Christ, it'll have our little logo, the little W with the two heads that makes it look like a couple people. And if you click on that, it has both of last Sunday's sermons in video format. So you can watch it right there on your smartphone, or you can watch it on your computer, or if you have one of the newer TVs, you can watch it right on there. And we already have 100 views from last Sunday morning's sermon. So it's going very well. It's pretty good quality. I think you'll enjoy it. So go on there and check that out if you haven't done so already. It seems that the most significant theological question of our time has to do with why do bad things happen to good people? Has anybody heard that question before? Why do bad things happen to good people? Do you have a good answer for that? Because I don't. Okay. You know, when we think about the question, it really is difficult. Because we look and we know that our God is just, and He is good, and He is kind, and He is loving. And there are some things about His character and His nature that we've been taught and we believe and we assert boldly. But yet when we put the whole package together, it's a little difficult to answer some of the specific questions that people have. Epicurus said it best. He's the ancient philosopher who, in doubting the existence of a single all-powerful God, simply phrased the question in this way. If God wishes to prevent evil but cannot, then He is not all-powerful. That's a fair statement. If God wants to stop evil and can't do it, then He's not all-powerful. If God can prevent evil, but He will not, then He is not all good. If He has both the power and the will to eliminate evil, then why is there evil in the world? Here's the truth. That is a fair question, isn't it? Because you look around us to the world and you see tremendous tragedy, both at the hands of evil people and also just based on the circumstances of this world. Tsunamis and typhoons and hurricanes and earthquakes. And innocent people, particularly in third world countries, innocent people die by the tens of thousands sometimes. And when we say innocent, we don't mean sinless, but we mean people who didn't bring that particular natural disaster on themselves in any way. Then we look at that and we say, well, could God have stopped that? Could God have done something about it? It's a tough question. And we look and we see the evil people in the world. We look at not only the mess type of evil that's done from the Stalins and the Hitlers and the Pol Pots and those type of dictatorial regimes, but we look even at the murders in Detroit with the gangs and all of the violence and the suffering. We look at the terrorism. I mean, we've seen some of that in the last week or two, haven't we? And that could easily have been a church that a terrorist walked into and killed all of those people. And we look and we say, why? Why, Lord, why do you allow this? Why is this happening? We don't understand this. And if we don't understand it, I can guarantee you that when we go out and try to be an evangelistic church, which is what this church is all about, bringing, teaching, keeping, as we try to do that, we are going to have to answer the question of suffering. We have to. Now, typically, we give one of the three gold standard answers. You know what they are. In fact, when I asked a while ago, well, how do you explain it? Most likely, one of these three answers, or all three of them, ran through your mind. We might say, well, God is the standard, and without Him, how do we even know if there's evil or not? In other words, it's not fair to ask the question, because we wouldn't even know that something is evil or good if there wasn't a God who isn't those things. He is the ultimate standard of which we know, that by which we can determine that which is good and bad, that which is evil, that which is right. Or someone may answer, well, love allows freedom of choice. In other words, people aren't really free. They can't choose if God didn't allow them to do these terrible things. And certainly that academically is an accurate answer. Intellectually, it fits, but it doesn't really help when you're hurting or when you're the victim of that freedom of choice. In fact, freedom of choice, as much as we love liberty, I'm not sure we love liberty as much as we really think that we do. A lot of our struggle right now is with terrorism and all of that. You realize in our country, liberty will be threatened because when it comes to safety versus liberty, what will people choose? Well, historically, you know what people always choose? Safety over liberty. You know, you look at your kids. You want your kids to go to heaven? Or would you rather them have free will? Let me tell you. I choose for them not to be free if it's my choice. I mean, liberty's great, right? But is it better than life? Would you give me liberty or give me death? That's our motto in this nation. Yeah, but when the rubber hits the road, is that really people's motto? You know what I mean? So to say that, you know, it's right that all this evil's in the world because God has to allow people free will. No, why does God have to allow the evil people free will? Why can't He just allow the good people free will? You know, that's a fair question, isn't it? The third thing. Well, and this is the most interesting of all three answers. And all of these have some truth. Don't think I'm running down intellectually these answers. They're true. Because we'll say, well, there's often good that comes from suffering. Don't we say that? You got to look that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So the fact that you're hurting and it feels like somebody pulled your heart out and stomping it in the dust, this is a good thing. It doesn't feel like a good thing. You see, all of those answers, however true they may be, however rational they may appear, do very little to comfort when we're in the midst of suffering. And frankly, are very poor tools to convince people that there's a loving God who is looking down upon their life when they feel like their life is an absolute disaster. To say, well, this hurting you're going through is really a good thing someday. You know what the answer is going to be? Well, I don't want to serve a God like that. To say that, well, you know, God has to allow this person to have destroyed your family because, you know, that evil person has to have free will too. Well, maybe I don't want to serve a God who lets monsters have free will so they can hurt me. Do you understand? Those questions, those answers are academically, intellectually, rationally true, but not very convincing or helpful. So let me tell you, we can talk about those in Bible class. Maybe not even in Bible class, because we're going to have hurting people there. We can talk about them in casual conversation. But let's refrain from sharing any of those three answers anymore. with people who are in the midst of hurting. Can we do that? Because they don't help. They wouldn't even help us, those of us who are rooted in faith. Because the reality is one thing we have to keep in mind, the thing that we're engaging in this morning, and that people all around us, even believers when they're going through suffering, engage in, which is to question and to wonder and to cry out to the heavens, why me? Why, Lord? Why haven't you done anything about this? That tendency is not a lack of faith. It's a part of the human experience. And we miss that. In the church all my life, I have seen kind of I guess you might say, a textbook attitude towards suffering where, if you're spiritual, you won't question. If you're spiritual, you won't ask the hard questions because every question has to have an answer. Haven't we been that way in the church? We don't like anything except exact formulas that have exact answers because we're the most rational, we're the most modernist, we're the most, formulaic type of people. But there are some questions, folks, that nobody has the answer to on this earth. And that the only thing we can do is strap in our seatbelt and trust God anyway. It's the only answer sometimes. And sometimes when we're desperate to reach for whatever answer we can, those answers become more hurtful than helpful. So when we look at this, we realize God's people have always, it is not a lack of faith to, in the midst of your pain, to wonder and to ask God, even to ask God hard questions. Look at Numbers chapter 11. In Numbers chapter 11, we see Moses, that great leader, and no one could ever question his faith and his commitment to the Lord and to God's people and God's cause. But in Numbers 11 verse 10 it says, Moses, he heard the people weeping throughout the families, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you afflicted your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Now, it wasn't God's fault that those Israelites had been given every evidence and opportunity to have faith and were the most faithless people imaginable. But it sure felt to Moses like it wasn't his fault either, and that God could have done something about it. So Moses just lays it out. What have I done, Lord? What have I done to deserve them? He's very, very direct and very frustrated. But what's interesting is even though he's complaining, in verse 14 it says, I am not able to bear all the people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. If you'll treat me like this, please kill me here and now. Well, that's pretty straight. But you know what? God doesn't rebuke him or chastise him. The next section in my Bible says God provides for Moses. Because God didn't see that as a lack of faith. He saw that as a communication born of relationship. That's what we do when we're frustrated toward the people we love. We communicate. We look over in 1 Kings chapter 19. We see another great hero of faith in Elijah, verses 9 and 10. And then he went into a cave and he spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets of your sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life as well. He's complaining in the cave. And he says, Lord, this isn't fair. It isn't right. Why haven't you done something about it? You see, the point that we take from these passages, and there are many others. We could spend all morning reading such passages of different heroes of faith, because when you put it all together, it's very clear. It's not a lack of faith. None of these men were condemned for expressing their feelings. God doesn't judge us by expressing our true heart and emotion to Him, regardless of what's in that true heart and emotion. He would judge us only if we failed to obey because we turned away from Him in rebellion. You see, Moses still got up and did what he was called to do, regardless of how he felt. Elijah still got up and went and faced the prophets of Baal again, regardless of how he felt. You see, the emotion isn't wrong. The emotion is just being honest. Consider Jeremiah. I've told you about this before. In Jeremiah 15:18, he says, "You, O Lord, are like an unreliable stream, that when I go to drink, you leave me dry." That is so very direct and accusatory to God. But then in Lamentations 3:22 through 24, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every day. You see, Jeremiah wrote both of those passages. And one of them is rooted in how he felt in the moment, and so is the other. Men and women of God, we have to face suffering, and it causes our emotions to spin out of control and us to ask questions. And the place those questions need to go is we don't need to ask the world, and we don't need to ask philosophies, and we don't need to ask the reasoning of mankind. We need to take those hard questions about God directly to God. Directly to God. Just as every great person of faith who had the exact same questions always has. Therefore, how do we be like Moses and like Elijah and like Jeremiah, to look suffering square in the eye, and even though we feel so very devastated, and in our reasoning we can't understand, and we even want to question, how do we see it through? How do we serve anyway? How do we press on in faith? Well, a few suggestions. Number one, and these are born of just a lifetime of observation of how people wrongly handle suffering. Number one, we've got to not see God as our grandfather God. You know what I mean by a grandfather God? My grandfather was the greatest. But part of the reason he was the greatest is he didn't have any of my daddy in him. Now, I love my daddy. My daddy's the greatest, but my grandpa always felt like the greatest. My dad felt like the greatest about 22% of the time, okay? And the rest of the time he was being daddy. Because grandpa never made me go cut a switch. Now, he may have told my dad on me, and my dad made me go cut a switch, but Grandpa never did. Grandpa never raised his voice. Grandpa, because his philosophy was, I get to enjoy them, and then you got to take them home. You know? Any of you grandparents, is that your MO when it comes to being a grandparent? That's the glory of grandparenthood, right? Well, God is our Father. He's not our grandfather. You understand? Amen. And people get that wrong. People see God as a lucky rabbit's foot in the sky. But sometimes a father is that. My father provided what I needed, but he also was a drill sergeant when I needed it too. And if we had a different view of God, then maybe we would stop asking in every single circumstance of every single moment of suffering, why, as if his sole purpose of existence, the creator of the universe, is to make our lives perfect. He is God. Newsflash, we are not. We are not. God is gentle, but He is not soft. God is always loving, but get this, He is not always tender. That's even true of Jesus. Jesus is always loving, but Jesus isn't always tender. You don't believe me? Go back in the first century and be a money changer. Or a Pharisee. Pain was never something that God promised us that we would completely be without. Do you realize that? There are some things we take for granted that are never a promise. Do you realize that? Lack of suffering, lack of persecution. In our country, religious freedom. Those are not promises. Those are not promises that God made. I'll rescind that statement if you find any of it in the Scriptures. Because you won't. In fact, we have passages like 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4. Where Peter is very plain. And there's no passage in all of Scripture quite as helpful when it comes to suffering and persecution as 1 and 2 Peter. But he says in chapter 4, verse 12, Beloved, do not think it's strange. Do not think it is strange. Do not think it's weird. Do not think it's abnormal. What other synonym do you want to throw in there? Do not think it's uncustomary. Do not think it's strange concerning the fiery trial which will try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. You see, somehow we got the idea that if I'm a Christian, I'll be protected from suffering. When the Bible says again and again and again and again and again, Christians will suffer. I think we need to tell even new converts that. Because that's just, we're preaching the truth, aren't we? And that's the truth. God is not a grandfather God. And if we have such a view of God, suffering will blow us out of the water. It will. Secondly, we have to make sure, and I say this with all compassion, because in no way are we trying to imply that all of life's problems are our own fault. So don't take that from this. But in reality, some of life's problems are our own fault. So what we have to do, number two, is we must make sure that we aren't the source of our own problems. There are three sources of problems in this world. There's the devil in the world. There's God, because one is the devil wants to tempt you, and God will sometimes test you. Only real difference, motive. A temptation is given so you'll fail. A test is given so you'll succeed. It's the real difference. But there's a third source of problem. Me. Isn't that right? If someone says, I can't believe I'm hungry, but they won't, do what they need to do to eat, which is work or whatever it may be, then they really need to take a moment of self-reflection. If someone says, I just can't find love in my life, and the only place they look is in bars, then maybe it's not that they just can't find it. Maybe they need to look in the mirror and say, where am I looking? You understand? If someone says, well, I just don't have good health, and they buy 3 packs a day, maybe they should look in the mirror. You understand? And so, maybe the first thing we should do when we endure suffering is not assume that it's our fault, because much of the time, folks, it isn't. There's still the devil in the world, and there's still God testing us. But I think it'd be fair to say at least a third of the time, the source is me. And so we need to look and do some self-reflection. Sometimes when we blame God for beating us, we fail to look down and see the rod is in our own hand. We fail to see that. If you take the wrong bus and you end up in the wrong place, it's not God's fault. We have to stop seeing Him as the source of all pain. And number 3, we have to stop relying upon our patent explanations. We mentioned 3 of them in the beginning. And intellectually those may make sense, but People don't want to hear about the virtues of suffering when they're suffering. People don't want to hear about what God is trying to teach them when their life is falling apart. And you may think, well, who would say that? I have heard those kind of answers in funeral home parlors for 25 years. You know, the only thing you need to say when someone's died, I know it's awkward. So here's a good plan. Just don't say anything. Just come with your hug gun loaded. Right? And if you have to say anything, just say, I'm sorry. And I love you. And if someone says, why did this happen to me? Why is God doing this? Say, I don't have any answers. I'm sorry. And I love you. We need to spend less time explaining and more time eradicating suffering. Because you know what? Jesus did not say, I was naked and you explained it to me. He said, I was naked and you clothed me. He did not say, I was hungry and you gave me a sound argument. He said, I was hungry and you fed me. We need to stop relying on intellectual observations to help people in their suffering, because they just don't help. Now, that might be a good discussion to have after they're through the suffering, when they're better, when they can look at things rationally. But I don't know about you, but when my life is falling apart, my rational thinker doesn't think very well. It just doesn't work very well. The only explanation needed is one the criminal on the cross realized. You know, he didn't ask Jesus to take him down. He believed he was God in the flesh. And surely he believed that Jesus could remove himself and those criminals if he wanted to. But the criminal didn't ask for that, did he? Why? He was near a God who was suffering with him. And he knew that he didn't have to suffer alone. And that he was going to be with him when it was all over. And that was enough. That was enough. Fourthly, and we'll close with this, we have to stop asking, why me? This is the one that I'm going to hit the hardest, and I'm going to be very brief, but very direct. I have seen Christians in my life, and I'm trying, this is not directed at you who are suffering right now if you're hurting. This is directed at all the rest of you who are going to suffer. Because that means all of you. You will. All right, hold on, just kind of take a moment, look down at your chest, see if it's moving in and out because you're breathing. If that applies to you, you're going to suffer again. Understand? So this applies to everyone. Stop asking, why me? The question is arrogant. It's arrogant. Because let's be very clear. Have you heard of a man named Abraham? He's called the father of faith and a friend of God. He took his only son that he'd waited 100 years for and marched 3 days up a mountain with a knife in his back pocket, willing to give him to God. And with that kind of faith, Abraham suffered. Moses, who had the courage to stand before the most powerful man in the world and demand God to let his people go. Moses, who suffered with those people who were disreverent and who were disobedient over and over and frustrated Moses. Moses, who wandered in the wilderness in service to God for 40 years. Moses suffered. The apostles. You heard of the apostles? Do you know that of the 12 apostles, all but one of them died a violent death? And the one who didn't died in exile, prisoner. One of them was run through with a halberd in India. Another was run through with a spear. 2 were hung. 3 were crucified. And Peter was crucified upside down in Rome because he didn't feel worthy enough to be killed in the exact manner of Jesus, the Son of God. And these men gave up everything for him and took the gospel to the ends of the world. Have you heard of Paul? Saul of Tarsus, who gave himself to Jesus there when Ananias baptized him after his experience on the road to Damascus, and who was beaten and stoned, who was imprisoned and finally beheaded because he wouldn't compromise his faith. He suffered. And what about Jesus Christ? The suffering servant, the man of sorrows, who every moment of his adult life that he walked this earth literally carried the burden of the world on his shoulders because one sin and we all would have been lost. He saved us every day. And you know stress, you don't know stress. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. None of us know stress to what Jesus felt every day of his life. And then he was beaten, and every ounce of flesh was stripped from his back, and the rods were taken to him, and a crown of thorns pressed on his head, and they laughed at him, and they mocked him, and they spat in his face, and he fell under the cross. He was nailed to it, and then God turned away from him because of our sin, and he died, as we sing, alone for you and me. Jesus suffered. So when I say, Lord, how dare you allow me to suffer? I forget that I'm not worthy to tie those men's sandals. Amen. If you aren't willing to suffer, don't be a Christian. Because that's part of what it means. Amen. And every servant of God that has gone before suffered. How dare I ever think that I deserve better than them? So what do? How do we help people as they face suffering in this world? Well, we don't give those intellectual answers. They're true. They all have some merit. They're not helpful. You know what we do? If you had a little child that needed a vaccination, why does any kid like needles? If your kid likes needles, you need to take him to the psychologist because he's a weirdo. Okay? Kids don't like needles. And when that nurse is coming with that vaccination, why are we subjecting that child to that suffering? Because it's good for them. We know it. But it doesn't feel like it's good for them. And you know what he does? He cries, Mommy, Mommy, Mommy. And even though he has to go through it, what we don't say is, now son, wrap your 3-year-old mind around the reality that this is going to prevent you from viral infections. He doesn't care about viral infection. He just knows it hurts. And the only thing that makes it better is for Mama to wrap her arms around him, pat his head, tell him she loves him. That's what we need to do, folks. Wrap our arms around people who are suffering. Save the explanations for later when their brain starts working again. And just act like Mama. Wrap your arms around him, pat him on the head if you need to. Tell him you don't know why either. Just tell him you love him. Because we're never going to have all the answers. But I can tell you this. I thought about this stuff a lot. You know, I'm the strange breed of preacher, 1 in 1,000 who enjoys philosophy as well as theology. So I've studied a lot of it. I've taught it. And one thing I realized through that exploration is that We don't have all the answers, but the world doesn't have any answers either. And so I'm going to trust that which has the most evidence and that which makes rational sense, that there's a creator God who loves me. And in that tremendous book of the ages, those ancient words explain more than anything else this world has to offer. So when I don't have the right answers, rather than grasping for them, I'm just going to say, I don't know, so I'm going to trust you. This morning, if you just need to trust Him more, maybe you're one of these people, maybe you're suffering right now. If that's true, let us be that mama to you. Let us wrap our arms around you and pat you on the head and just go through it with you. We're not going to try to tell you why. There's no explanation that would even help. But we've come today with our hug gun loaded and ready to bear, right? If you need to come for any reason, come right now as we stand and as we sing.